Did Jesus break the Sabbath commandment? And this springs from a story you find in the Gospel of John chapter 9, where he healed a man who was blind on the Sabbath day. And the religious leaders then, in verse 16, John 9:16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And so they use that as an argument. They're actually using the argument of his enemies to say it isn't necessary to keep the Sabbath. Well, I don't believe that that's a very good argument. For one thing, sin is the transgression of the law. The Bible says Jesus committed no sin. You can read in the Gospel of John chapter 15, verse 10, Jesus said, I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So you can't go by the accusations of the Pharisees, or they also accused Jesus of being a glutton and a winebibber. Jesus was not a glutton, and he was not a drunk, which is essentially what they were saying there. And so just because they accused him of that, they also accused Jesus of being demon-possessed and of being a Samaritan, which he was not a Samaritan, and he was not demon-possessed. So yes, they did accuse him of Sabbath breaking. There were a number of examples in the Bible where there were disputes about the Sabbath, and we're going to look at some of those. But never in any of these disputes does he say it's no longer necessary to keep the Sabbath. Indeed, the Christian, bottom line, is a follower of Christ. What was the pattern and the example of Jesus? Luke chapter 4:16. So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read the Scriptures. His pattern, his habit, his custom from his youth was to go to church, keep the Sabbath. Did Jesus heal on the Sabbath? Yes. Do you ever find him in the carpenter shop on the Sabbath doing regular work? No. And so it's not ever an issue of did he keep the Sabbath? How did he keep it? There were man-made traditions that they had attached to the commandments of God. This is what Jesus said. You have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of God that you might observe your tradition. So the disputes about Jesus and the Sabbath had nothing to do with keeping the commandment. It had to do with their man-made traditions that they were attaching to the Sabbath. There are several examples of healings where you see this happen. He casts out devils on the Sabbath. You can read about that in Mark chapter 1. And, was he breaking the Sabbath when he cast out a devil? Obviously not. That's setting a person free from the enemy. People often came to Jesus after the Sabbath for healing because the religious leaders said doctors were not supposed to practice their craft on the Sabbath day. An example is Mark 1:32. And at even, when the sun had set and the Sabbath was over, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed. Very rarely did Jesus heal people on the Sabbaths because he knew it would stir up his enemies. Every time he did heal somebody, it wasn't orchestrated or prepared. Someone showed up who was clearly suffering, and his heart was moved, and he helped them. And he gave some examples that this is what you do if the ox falls in the ditch or your sheep falls in the ditch on the Sabbath day. You help them out. All right, you've got Mark chapter 12, verse 1. He said that he's going through the grain fields on the Sabbath day. He's teaching the disciples. They got hungry. And it says they reached out and they plucked off some of the heads of grain. They'd rub it in their hands, blow away the chaff. It was obviously ripe. They'd toss the kernels in their mouth. They were just hungry. And so even it's like eating sunflower seeds. You don't get much. But then some of the Pharisees were watching and they said, your disciples are not keeping the Sabbath. You are teaching them to break the Sabbath. And Jesus answered by telling them, have you not read, this is again Matthew chapter 12, verse 3, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him, how they entered into the house of God and they ate the shewbread that was not lawful to eat except for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Meaning, on the Sabbath day, the priests would serve, they had to sacrifice lambs, which can be a little work intensive. But it was part of what they did to make worship for everyone else possible. Now keep in mind, this is part of Old Testament Sabbath keeping. Jesus said there's a principle that sometimes you have to do things even on the Sabbath day. In the temple they had Sabbath guards for security. On the Sabbath day, they had to bring in wood to keep the altar burning, and they brought in water for the laver so that they could wash. So, Sabbath day, deacons might need to take chairs and move them for the potluck. There's some things that may have to happen. Do everything in advance that you can. Christ is saying, this isn't breaking the Sabbath day. They said the Jews, these Pharisees were saying the apostles were harvesting. Well, that's hardly harvesting. That's what you call being legalistic. And they were gleaning, which, by the way, is supported. Leviticus 23:22, you are allowed to glean a little grain from your neighbor's fields. They did it while they were walking. If you're walking down the road and you pick an apple hanging over the fence into the sidewalk and you eat it, you cannot be accused of harvesting. Well, someone could accuse you, but they would be legalistic. No, Jesus did not break the Sabbath. What about when you read in Matthew 12, verse 9, it says he departed from this experience. He goes to the synagogue. The word synagogue means church, the gathering. And there was a man who had a hand that was all gnarled up and withered. And Jesus, before he heals him, notice what he says. He says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they were looking to accuse him. And he said, what man is there among you who has one sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful. So Jesus is going to heal this man with a withered hand. He says it is lawful. He's not breaking the Sabbath day. The other disputes about the Sabbath were all about healing on the Sabbath day. Told the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched out. It was restored. And then the Pharisees went out from that experience and plotted how they might destroy him. I mean, that man was really happy he came to church that day and had his hand restored. So then you've got a crippled woman. She is bent over. She had been doubled over for 18 years. And Jesus is saying to them, you hypocrites, each of you on the Sabbath day will loose his ox or his donkey from the stall. You lead your animals away to water them on the Sabbath day. If you got a cow that needs milking, you milk it on the Sabbath day. Ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, who Satan is bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? It does not mean that you're breaking any law by doing a healing on the Sabbath day. Luke 14, verse 1, he heals a man of dropsy. That's edema, swelling, buildup of fluid, and it was crippling him. And Jesus now says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. So, again, he says, you do this for your donkey or an ox. If it had fallen into a pit, you take them out of the Sabbath day. They could not answer him. So he healed the man with dropsy on the Sabbath day. Notice again, he's saying this is in harmony with the law. And then there's the paralytic man who is let down through the roof. And this is the Sabbath day. He heals him. And then he says, take up your bed and go to your house. Well, obviously, you can roll up your sleeping bag and carry it home. If you experience a miraculous healing like that, you might not carry that burden around under normal circumstances. But Jesus was not telling him that the Sabbath did not matter. Then you got the healing of the blind man that we mentioned. And that's John chapter 9. There's certainly nothing wrong with healing a person. You restore their sight. To have your eyes opened on the Sabbath day is a wonderful miracle of God. And all he had to do was wash, and his eyes were open. But they accused him of Sabbath breaking. You'll notice the big issue when Jesus had disputes regarding the Sabbath day in the New Testament is never was it important to keep the Sabbath day. Christ always believed it was important to keep the Sabbath day. Jesus is the one who gave us the Sabbath day. The Bible says all things that were made by him. So he is the one who created for 6 days. He is the one who commanded us to rest on the seventh day. It was Christ who wrote the Ten Commandments in stone. All things that were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. He's not going to break his own law. And he even says, I've kept my Father's commandments. Jesus did not break the Sabbath day, friends. He showed us how to truly keep it. And the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 4 that we should not stumble because of unbelief. There remains therefore the keeping of a Sabbath for the people of God. You don't want to miss that blessing.